wait until people have... Okay, well, we'll start then if that's okay. Good afternoon, welcome. We have a full quorum and full attendance by members. We did have an apology noted in the minutes in the agenda recording apology of Your Worship the Mayor, but nice to see Rachel here, thank you. Confirmation of order of business. Item 12. Interim audit letter for the year ending 30th of June. Bede Kearney from Audit New Zealand is in the district. He's currently at TDC and will be coming here afterwards. So I'd like to move that item to the back end of the agenda to allow Bede to be present for that. Item 3, interests. Are there any updates or any conflicts that need to be stated for items on this agenda? No, thank you. Public forum, we've had no notification of public forum and no public forum here, so we will proceed. Confirmation of minutes, the minutes of the 10th of May 2016. Are they a true and accurate record? If so, could I have somebody who... Thank you, Brian. Sorry, yeah, Councillor Good. Thank you, Councillor Barker. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Chairman's report. The only comment I have to make on the Chairman's report is that I note this is the penultimate meeting of this committee. There is a requirement under the charter of this committee that we perform an annual review of this committee. And it's something I'll be talking to officers about how we might do that for the final meeting of this committee in August, so that we do have that as a completed task. So I have nothing further under Chairperson's report, so I'll move that that be received. Thank you, Councillor McGurk. All in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Item 7, the internal audit plan. We have Lynn Anderson, the internal auditor. So, Lynn, if you'd like to present your report.
Thank you. The internal audit plan for 2016-17, you see that in front of you. It's looking rather full, but I think that it's realistic. What I've done in compiling that is to firstly review the items that I haven't been able to get through last year, and then to review anything that's come up in the meantime and compare that with anything that was on the initial complete list of all audits that we thought needed to be done. So also making sure that we're reviewing risk registers and that kind of thing. And so this is the list that I've come up with. And you'll see that there are 31 audits through there, which is a reasonably high number, but that they've been split between 16 audits to be done by myself and the balance of them to be split between consultants and expert staff that we have. That probably will vary in terms of the degree of work that will be required by me. I imagine there'll be more required for staff audits that are done in terms of setting the scope, well, the purpose obviously, but the scope, and in reviewing what they have done, and perhaps with some training that's going to be needed in some instances as well. In terms of external auditors, I imagine that there'll be very little that will be required in that respect, but just just a review of what comes from those reports. There are there's just one major, well, it's not major, but one change to the process that we use, the internal audit procedure, and that was to extend the response time for correction action for high risks that were found in audits, and that's in response to the previous meeting where we talked about where some of the officers were unable to respond in a reasonable time. So we've looked at that and extended that period to 10 working days, which is, I think, more reasonable, and also going to look at making it easier for them to reply. I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Ms. Anderson. I'm just wondering, your workload here, 31 audits, is that going to bring you up, and you've had a lag this year where you haven't been able to do them all? Are you reasonably confident that you're able to, there'll be no lag from the end of next year?
Through the chair, yes, I'm hoping that I am going to be the way that I'll be able to make sure that I keep on track, perhaps better than I did last year, through experience, is to make sure that the scope is very accurate. Yeah. So focusing on the primary risks in those areas, and I think that that's where I'm going to be able to do some audits quicker than I've been able to from last year.
You've got the capacity in your workload for any new or emerging risks which haven't been identified, which have not yet been identified or not been aware of?
Through the chair, no. I think that what will happen by default is that some of the audits on here will get pushed out.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the report. It's great to see some activity planned to happen here, and I'm fully supportive of the fact that some other resources come in to help out in the space to get through the workload, because it is quite large. Just a comment really, and again it's one I seem to make regularly, is in the schedules that you've got, which sort of goes to be completed, the risks and the criteria, where you sort of list the areas that you're working in. I'd just like to see another column in there which sort of talks about what is the objective of doing a particular work stream. So if I have a look at one that says sensitive policy expenditure is one that you're going to have to look at. What's the objective of doing a review? Is it to make sure the policy is adequate or being complied with, or what is the, I suppose, the overall outcome that you're looking to achieve by doing all of the work? Just a wee column in there so you can see what sort of context that you're working with when you're having a look at these various systems would be helpful. That's all. Thank you.
Through the chair, yes, I agree, but as you'll be aware, Mr. Murray, that the objective is likely to change as the scoping is done and as the reviewing the audit and the different issues that arise through there. It'll probably change anyway, but I can see that it would be helpful to have something.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The risk of IT systems being overwritten or tampered with, is that covered anywhere in here, in this chart?
Through the chair, it does by default, because when transactions are reviewed, I look at the separation of duties and look at the different processes and where the control should be, and it does deal with IT processes, obviously, in 99% of the cases. In terms of a full IT review, I don't have the ability to be able to do that. I'm relying, you'll see on this first, in July 2016, there are 2 external reviews that are being done, which gives us some confidence in terms of external infiltration and that kind of thing. Making sure that we've got our external risk covered. I am also looking in some of these audits at having an external IT review done of particular systems that I think we do have risks in, but otherwise they are covered to some extent in each risk.
Mary's?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Lynn, I'm just looking at the report where you're planning on breaking up the workload at 5.3 of the report, and you talk about external contractors performing some of the audits yourself, and then expert officers within council. Are you satisfied, and it would be helpful if you could just explain, in terms of the internal audit procedure, is there a suitable separation there between the officers who may be undertaking those audit and the internal audit function, so that we've got that independence? How are you planning on approaching that?
Through the Chair, the internal audits that are being done by officers will be done by people who aren't actually undertaking the work themselves, and I'll be reviewing their results.
Any further questions? Councillor Barker?
In terms of the audit that you've got for cash collection, internal and external, are those four there the only ones that you'll actually be auditing? Do you have leases and other things like that? Does the audit, will the audit encompass wide enough to check that all lease payments have been paid and similar things to that? Or is it are you just planning it for this year on festivals, parking meters, the golf course and total mobility?
Through the Chair, yes to the latter point. Although I'm finishing, I've just done one on the Founders Book Fair, and I have done cash handling within Civic House, so money that we've received from different avenues into Civic House. That one's just been done. But these are the ones that are planned for this year, yes.
Thanks.
Anything further? Could I ask for a mover that the first two recommendations, the ones pertaining to this committee, that the report be received, and noting the change in the timeframes be reported? Thank you, Councillor McGurk. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Barker, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. And a recommendation to Governance Committee and Council that they be approved, and noting that there will be unbudgeted expenditure which will be reported through this committee once estimates have been confirmed. Could I have a mover and seconder for those? Mr Murray and Councillor Barker. Thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Moving now to item 8, accounting policies, and I think it's Ms Hughes.
This report is a kind of an interesting one in one respect. Accounting policies are probably not the most exciting read for most people. For most people. However, it is on the work plan for this committee this year, and it really does just allow you to consider them in isolation from the more exciting stuff that is in annual plans and annual reports. The recommendation, sorry, it's not in the recommendation, it is further down in the report. There is an opportunity here for you to think about what changes you might like to make to those policies, but we have to consider those changes within the other frameworks of NZGAP and PBE IPSIS. So it's not like you could say, can we have this change, and I can say yes, I'll go ahead and do it. So I just wanted to frame that for you. I'm not entirely sure there's much more I can add at this point, but I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Newman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, mine's just a procedural question, because the delegations say that this committee has the power to recommend to the governance committee, but when we move on to the recommendation, it actually doesn't go to the governance committee. So I'm just wondering whether it should be a recommendation to the governance and council, I presume, but I just didn't want to presume. Can somebody respond to that, please?
I'm informed that because it's only noting, that we're noting this at this stage rather than accepting any changes, there's no requirement for a recommendation to go forward.
Okay, so there are no changes at all? Okay. Guess that answers it then. Thank you.
Mr. Murray?
Thank you, through the chair. Contrary, it's a very interesting report. Thank you for providing it. And I suppose in the realms of accounting policies, regulations, and standards that we've got to adhere to, it's not uncomplex. It is very complex, and we've got a reasonably long history of building on what we've got to get to where we have done. And the key things in here for me are that we are compliant with NZGAP and the public sector accounting standards. And every now and again, audit raises a particular method with a particular issue with us around, I think it was valuation last time, of some assets which we are working with and working on. And fundamentally, importantly, it says to me that we're delivering what we're supposed to deliver. So I'm pretty happy, pretty comfortable with this report, and pretty happy with our accounting policies. I think if there was an issue which you'd like us to consider in terms of a change in accounting policy, I'd like to hear what that might be, but I would be surprised if there were any. So I'm very happy to note this, and very happy with the accounting policies as they stand, and very happy that as a result we robustly report our financial results, and we end up with a clean audit report at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Councillor Barker?
Yes, I was just going to follow up on Councillor Noonan's question. The delegation manual, does the delegation manual delegate down to Chief Executive the authority to approve the accounting policies? Is that someone must be approving it if it's not being approved by this committee and governance?
Through the chair, the accounting policies are in the annual plans and annual reports, and as effectively get adopted by council as those reports make their way through the committee and council structure. So effectively they are adopted by council.
Thank you. Any further questions? If not, could I have a mover and seconder for the recommendations that the report attachment be received? Oh, apologies, sir.
Mr. Chair, I was a bit slow and actually just signalling to you. I'm just wondering, so in terms of what's here, what is useful for the discussion is clearly as Ms. Harrison said, the accounting policies have essentially been adopted by council through the long-term plan, annual plan processes. But if there were items within here that needed some review or change, is the expectation that they would come to this committee in the first instance. So today there is an option. I'm just looking at the options for the committee. So you can either accept the recommendations as the accounting policies, or you can reject them and not receive them. And I'm not really sure that you could reject them, to be honest. I'm not sure about that. But what do you do if you want to change them? So the question is, you know, if the committee had looked at these today and said, look, actually there are some in here that we think need some revision, is the expectation that they would come back to this committee for that process?
I'll just give my comment before handing to Ms. Harrison. I would expect that any significant changes to accounting policy would come before the Audit, Risk and Finance Committee, Subcommittee. And as we've discussed, this committee doesn't have the authority to approve, so therefore would make a recommendation upwards to Governance Committee would be my expectation of that.
Thank you.
And further to that, I'd expect that if you say, okay, what's a good accounting policy to change? Valuation of fixed assets, right? An easy one to sort of think about how we change in terms of the method of doing that. Well, if we change that method, I would expect a paper that says, well, if we do that, it's going to mean our assets are going to be stated at this value versus that value, so there'll be a change in that. And the impact of that in terms of complying with GAP is this. which will be it either fits or it doesn't, and therefore you are likely to receive a clear audit opinion or not. So it's not just a case of just changing it. There's actually quite a big implication in any change that does happen, which needs to be analysed through, and that's actually a process in its own sort of right, which I'd expect to see.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just a follow-up question. So from time to time we've had some just general discussion around dividends and what we do with dividends and whether they are used to reduce debt or how we receive those. So that hasn't got moved any further than a sort of general discussion. If we wanted to do something about a change, would it be coming through this document here or coming through a different document?
Through the Chair, that would be coming through the investment policy document rather than this document, because that's to do with our investment in our CCTOs. So yes, and that's on the work programme of this committee.
It will be coming here. Thank you.
And that is something that can be signed off by council. Through the Chair, I was just going to highlight just in 5.7, we have actually highlighted one valuation issue that we do want to investigate over the next year, and that is in relation to buildings. We don't actually revalue them for accounting purposes at the moment, and as Mr. Murray highlighted, it will require a reasonable amount of investigation to look into an issue like that and how regularly you do it, that sort of things, and the implications. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. No further questions? Can I have somebody please move that the... Thank you.
I would like to see that there, so. that's
Thank you,
what I'm
Councillor
moving.
Parker. I'm advised we don't have the delegation to endorse.
I'm happy to move the resolution as stated.
Because
Thank you, Councillor Parker. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. That might be the way to address that. We can get that delegation. We move on then, please, to item 9, the procurement policy, and welcome Mr. Vaughan to talk to us about that.
Good afternoon, everybody. I guess I'll simply introduce this by saying that this is really about efficiency, clarity, and catching up with current practices in procurement, which is sort of in paragraph 4.1 of the covering paper, and leave the anything further to questions you may have.
Thank you. Open up for questions. Councillor Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not a member of this committee, so thank you for the opportunity. Under 5.2, I noticed you've got a new policy of preferred supplier arrangements. Is that a safe way of doing business? I mean, how do you actually get to that point that you have a preferred supplier?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the answer to the member's question is that you sign a contract with them to supply a certain range of goods and services at under certain conditions. That may include discounts, or it may include service performance guarantees, or those types of things. In effect, the council has such things at the moment. It has a single supplier, for example, for most of its stationery needs, and that is, I guess, a bit informal at the moment, and this policy will provide a mechanism for making that more firm, if I can put it that way.
And a follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair, and you've said negotiated for a fixed term. Have you got any idea what that term may be?
Again, Mr. Chairman, that certainly depends on the nature of the supply arrangement. They are typically for 12 months, but they can be, in my experience, for up to 3 years.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, thank you for the paper. I suppose when I first read it, I was a little bit concerned that it was back on our agenda, given that we had only just seen it recently at some stage in the last 12 or 18 months. And so my first reaction was, well, why are we re-looking at it when we've only just done a policy? And then I thought, well, okay, what's changed? Or what are the major changes between the policy that we approved 12 months ago, or whatever that was, and now? And I couldn't, mainly because I was working off my iPad, I couldn't actually put them side by side and work through what the major changes were. So I thought it'd be easier just to ask. So can you run us through the major changes and why we're sort of looking at it now?
And again, Mr. Chairman, through you, if I could hand this around, which is a little bit of a summary of the changes which have occurred as a result of my arriving here and looking at this, to be perfectly frank with the member in relation to his question. What you will see is that we have taken much of the former policy, and again it comes back to clarifying matters, setting firm limits in relation to particular steps in procurement, so that, for example, the effort involved is commensurate with the amount of money we're spending, and accounting for things like the fact that the council now is party to a number of fairly significant whole of government purchase agreements, which save us pretty substantial sums of money, to be perfectly honest. I'm happy to go through these points one at a time, but members may like a moment to look at them and ask anything that occurs to them as we go through.
It's difficult for members to take this in any detail, but if there are questions, please further clarification of these points required. Councillor Barker.
I'm just interested in under principles 3(1)(2), the buy local. Buy local is preferred. There's nothing in this to say that it must be buy local. You still take the cheapest, I would hope.
Mr. Chairman, again, in response to the specific point made by the member, it's preferred because sometimes we cannot. It's basically as simple as that. I looked at a contract the other day for a piece of pumping equipment which is going into an upgrade of our wastewater system, and the fact is it's coming from Germany. There isn't any choice in such matters.
Of course, but my point is that there's nothing written into this policy saying we must buy local. Thanks.
Yes, it's written as a principle, as a starting preference.
Yes.
And not as shut it down for all the other options. Again, Mr. Chairman, my apologies through you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments on the key changes?
Mr. Chair, my apologies, I'm still just referencing backwards and forwards, and I wouldn't mind just having a few moments to do that so that I can see where the policy has changed. That'd be all right. I won't be too much longer, but I have...
No, that's fine. I'll be guided by members as to take the time that you need. Let me know when we're ready to proceed. Councillor Barker.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, through you, yes, the answer is it does. This was written specifically in consultation with the people who do that particular part of the council's business. Obviously, some of the roading matters are connected back, if I can put it that way, to the New Zealand Transport Agency funding for those things. And you'll see provisions in here that refer specifically to the arrangements, if you like, with New Zealand Transport Agency for subsidy.
Well, if I could, as I saw it, the crux of what we did this morning was to provide the opportunity for the two neighbouring councils to work together in the procurement of contracts for roading. Is that included? Is that objective included in this?
It's, Mr Chairman, again through you, it's not a principle or an objective of this policy, but I'm confident, having looked at it from that perspective when we put it together, that there's nothing precluding cooperation with a neighbouring council. And in fact, obviously the things in relation to the most efficient way of purchasing, if that cooperation was the answer, then clearly it would cover that matter, or that matter would be covered in relation to the policy.
Yeah, because I think over the years we've looked at the possibility of more shared services, and more doing things together, such as in libraries, such as in a number of our activities, and none of them have really come off, to my knowledge.
Thank you, Councillor. Mary's.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Vaughan, just a question in relation to the objectives, and I do like the way that you've set this out with the objectives and principles following. In terms of objective 2.1a, you talk about to keep risks associated with purchase within Council's risk criteria. So is that, in terms of the risk criteria, is that referencing our risk register process?
Mr Chairman, through you, that is absolutely the case. Sorry, and I should explain for the benefit of this committee, the other hat I wear is Risk Advisor for the Council, and there is some work underway, and we'll be referring to this when we bring a paper to the next meeting of this committee, to upgrading those criteria. It's work in progress.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Watt. Mr Murray?
Again, just because I haven't chance to get my head around this particular change, but your bandings that you've got, so you've got purchases under 5,000 are dealt with this way, you've then got purchases between 5 and 25,000 this way, then you've got 25 to 100,000 that way, and then over 100,000 this way. That sort of comes out of the flow chart. Have those bands changed from the old policy? Have they moved up or down, or are they the same?
Mr Chairman, through you, the two things have happened from the previous policy. One of those is that the bandings have changed to better reflect how much effort is involved to make a purchase of how much and how much needs to be involved. And the second thing is the previous policy was a bit open, if I can put it that way, in respect of where you switched from requiring, for example, merely to get 3 quotations to a full public advertisement of a larger project.
So supplementary, are you able just to run us through the boundary changes so that we sort of understand it's gone from 50,000 to 100,000, or is that too far a question today?
I'm not sure that I can, Mr Chairman, again through you, I'm not sure that I can do this all off the top of my head. The previous policy did not strictly, to start at the bottom if I could, did not strictly have a lower figure below which you didn't require a quote. That was one of the uncertainties in the previous policy. So there is now such a figure. So there's not a one-to-one comparison there. In the next step where we are requiring quotations, the figure has changed, I believe from memory, from 10,000 to 25,000. The subsequent steps are the same as the previous policy. Again, I'm not sure that I've got everything completely right. It might give you a reasonable picture.
While people are considering, I had 2 points. One has been partly answered in your response to Councillor Matheson. The inclusion of the preferred supplier status in here has triggered a couple of questions for me, and it has been my experience that preferred supplier contracts are often managed in a way that's slightly different to pure value. In for instance, they are the approval of them or allocation of them requires some additional layer either through the panel or one step up. And similarly there's no automatic renewal without again coming back to that panel, and that's something I wonder if we should reflect in here. My second point is a purely semantic one and relates to the last dot point in 4.21 on page 42, where it talks about these, unless these documents have been reviewed by Council's legal advisor. I would assume that implied there is reviewed and approved by Council's legal advisor, not just reviewed as such.
Mr. Chairman, taking your second point first, yes. In relation to the first one, preferred supplier contracts, in my experience, and we are still, as I say, we've come from an informal situation in the council to formalising this a bit further, relate not simply to, if I can put it this way, cash value, but to overall value to the council in terms of the total purchase. And that may include things like guarantees of supply within a particular time. It may also include aggregation of the accounting, which obviously saves the council money in terms of processing the account. And it may also include other performance factors specific to the goods in hand or the service in hand for that matter. So yes, all of those things would typically be taken into account in a preferred supplier arrangement. And yes, finally, these are all, and this refers to the earlier point I think made by Councillor Matheson, that these are all a fixed term. They do need to be, because they lock both parties down for a fixed term.
Thank you. Further questions for Mr. Vaughan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it may not be a question for Mr. Vaughan, but it's just arising from the discussion you've just been having in relation to the preferred supplier status. And I'm just thinking about the addressing the risk criteria. One of the things that I have been looking at here is just wondering whether the policy should be overt in ensuring that if elected members have a preferred supplier status with council, that we are very clear about making sure that that is overtly shown on the risk register for the individual member in relation to what the contracts are. And I'm just raising that on the back of actually a bit of a discussion we had at council meeting in relation to pecuniary interests. So I just wonder if that's something that Mr. Vaughan had turned his mind to, just in terms of making sure that we've got the right records, and whether that's something that would be appropriate in here or not.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try and partially answer the question, which I think is the best I may be able to do. You will see a number of references in this policy to conflict of interest provisions elsewhere in the council's procedures, and it is my understanding, though I couldn't sit here and hold my hand on my heart, that that is sufficient to encompass such the possibility that you raise. I'm sorry, that may be a partial answer.
That's all right. So just for clarity, that in that case, that there is other policy where that action should be undertaken as opposed to through this policy. Is it the view?
That is, sitting here this afternoon, that is my understanding. Could I quote you the line, sorry again, Mr. Chairman, could I quote you the exact line without the documents in front of me? No, I'm sorry.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I'd ask that recommendation this report be received. Mover and seconder for that. Councillor McGurk. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Mr. Murray. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. And the recommendation to Governance Committee and Council that the revised procurement policy be adopted. Mover for that, please, Councillor McGurk. Seconded by Mr. Murray again. Thank you, Mr. Murray. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Mr. Vaughan. We move to item 10, which is the Employee Conflicts of Interest Policy. And I'm looking, I think, to Nikki for that.
the chair. So the employee conflicts of interest policy has been brought to this committee for its information, and that's primarily around the reputational risk that employee conflicts of interest poses for this council. So previously we have had conflicts of interest managed in a bit of an ad hoc way across council. We've historically always had senior leadership team, the building unit and the resource consent unit recording their conflicts in spreadsheets. We've built on that good work and we've formalised a conflict of interest policy, and we are using the health and safety and control system so that all the conflicts are recorded and reviewed by the employee's manager to ensure that it is actually, that there are adequate controls in place. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms Harrison. Any questions? Members, Councillor Barker.
Thank you. Do we have a list of the interests, pecuniary interests in businesses or otherwise outside of council that staff members have? Do we ask staff members to declare, as do councillors?
Through the chair, as I alluded, it has been on an ad hoc basis. When we employ people, those things are recorded at the time of employment, and they're recorded within each business unit and acknowledged, but they haven't historically been recorded all in one place, which is what we're proposing to do going forward. So we'll be doing a sweep back around the organisation to ensure that we've got it all covered.
Thank you. Madam Mayor?
So then I'll just test out the last policy and say, so here we've got a specific one. So if an employee was a preferred supplier to council, would I expect to see that recorded in Info Council overtly?
Through the chair, it wouldn't just be if they were a preferred supplier, it was if they had supplied any goods to council or their partner supplied any goods.
Okay, and so that would be overtly recorded in the council process. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Gurk?
Yeah, that just raises an issue. You've certainly got pecuniary interests, but what about the particularly non-pecuniary interests in terms of relationships, or how that is that relying basically essentially on a self-declaration by employees? A pecuniary interest is relatively easy. Supply goods or services to council, has received goods and services to council, are relatively easy. But I'm just throwing a bit more discussion, a bit more comment around what we call non-pecuniary interests that possibly could create that conflict.
Through the chair, I believe the policy includes pecuniary and non-pecuniary interests and relationships and etc. So I don't think it relates, specifically to just pecuniary.
If I can just comment on that, item 4, number 4 talks about relationship or other role that the employee has or something the employee has said or done.
Things I'm thinking about, a membership of a particular organisation. There might be a particular sports club or social organisation or something like that. How deep are the employees expected to declare, or how much is the organisation expected to know? Bearing in mind this is actually probably a very large village, so
Well, I suppose I would have thought that the line, and it's a nebulous one, is if it's going to cause reputational risk to us. So the fact that I'm a member of a rugby club may not necessarily be of interest unless it's of interest, and it's a judgment call.
Thank you, Mary. Any other questions? If not,
It's a
me, maybe, I'm just picking up on that last one. I mean, if a fairly senior staff member, and this is picking an example out of nowhere, but if a fairly senior member of the staff was a member of maybe a rugby club, and then they were in a position where they could direct where that rugby club may, if they're in a decision-making role or a direction role, then I would expect them to make a statement.
Yes, and that's exactly the point. If they are, and is that part of a reputational risk issue? But if they're not, you wouldn't.
So then I think the direction is just that the staff, when they're employed, they just need to be made aware that if they are in a role, if they are a member of something, then and they are in a decision-making or direction-making role in council as part of their job, then they should be made aware that that's something they should raise at the time. It's for us it's just normal, but for the staff it may not be. So it maybe just need to go on the list of things that gets noted when they're employed.
Through the chair, I would also like to highlight that it's not just an ongoing conflict of interest. It can also be time bound as well. I mean, it may be that for a point in time that particular person might be in an acting role and only have a short-term conflict, that sort of thing. So we have the mechanisms to record ongoing conflicts that are basically there throughout your employment versus a potential short-term conflict. So we have the way, and we continually will remind staff on an ongoing basis that they need to keep this up to date, and it will get reviewed at SLT. It will get reviewed regularly to make sure that we've got a good look across the organisation.
Mr. Murray?
Yes, and look, Section 5 of the policy says expectations of individuals covered by the policy, which is obviously the staff. The last sentence says it. Employees need to take great care to avoid situations where they could be accused of using their position to further their personal interests, financial or otherwise. And that's really about as good a sweep as you can get, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. A quick procedural question from me. The process by which a new staff member coming on board is made aware of this policy and the information is tracked. Is it? I don't necessarily need to know the detail. Is it an established process that we feel confident allows every staff member the opportunity to do this?
Very confident. So during the interview process, we ask them about memberships because it's obviously something that people don't necessarily think about when they come and work at council. So we track it then, and then through our induction process, part of that induction process is going through those policies in detail with the staff member and getting those recorded up front.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. Any further questions on this policy? If not, could I have a mover that the report to employee conflicts and its attachment be received?
Happy to move.
Thank you, Councillor Barker.
Happy to second.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Half the time I get it wrong. The other half I get it right, which is good. This is here as a consequence of a request at the previous meeting for information to come here. So this report has come like this. I would like perhaps to try and separate this discussion into two parts. One, a clarification of any further questions and further issues and further information that is required for this, and then into any discussion. Just on a point of clarification, before we can discuss this report, do I need to move it's received, or can we discuss it in depth if we need to? Just carry on.
To move we receive the report.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Seconded by Mr. Murray. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. So if I can now just see if there's any questions of clarification required. Mr. Murray?
Just one of clarification. assuming we're doing in two parts, yeah? Okay. 4.2 says that the trust provide audited accounts to the council's CFO within 3 months of the trust balance date. Just a question, has that been happening and do we have those?
Through the chair, yes, we have been receiving them.
Councillor Mathis.
Thank you. Well, on top of that question, I'm just wondering if we get to a point in this discussion, Mr. Chairman, that we are going to look for a way of being able to get some payment. I would be rather helpful if I knew what the financial situation was at the latest, which would highlight the ability or otherwise.
Ms. Harrison, do we have that information as a piece of information available? Not immediately, but we'll see if we can find that. Mr. Murray?
Subsequent question to just some clarification around what's in the paper. I noticed that there was a High Court review on a minute from a judge saying that the asset can't be transferred. And I understand that was under appeal. Has there been any outcome of that?
Who's in a position to answer that? Is Mr. Ward approaching the table to answer it? No, he's approaching the door to exit it. You do very well, man.
The question was, we're just seeking some clarification on some of the points in the report, and I just noted that there was some sort of issue around the transfer of the asset to council, and the High Court got involved, and there was a minute from a judge, and it sort of left it all up in the air as to whether it could or it couldn't. And my question is, has that been further resolved to a point of definitively is that or is that not?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm reminded that it must be Alzheimer's week because we're collecting for it tomorrow, and I'm having one of those moments right at the moment. My recollection is that it was resolved, and I think off the top of my head it was found not to be an issue. It was found not to be a barrier to proceeding, but that the proposition was put to one side as a result of earthquake-prone buildings, meaning that School of Music was into a different headspace. So, apologies, I can't give you more detail than that.
Thank you. Ms. Harrison, do you have an answer to the first question or anything to add to that? The first question relating to Councillor Matheson's question about the funding, about the financial state.
Through the chair, we're going away to get a hold of the financial statements.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Executive. Any other questions or clarification, further information required? If not, I'll perhaps move into more open discussion about where we go to from here. If this matter has now adequately been dealt with to the subcommittee's satisfaction, or if there is any further thoughts about whether the situation needs further resolution. So take any discussion on that. Councillor Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I actually think I was the one that asked if we could have an update, and I thank Ms. Harrison for doing this and providing a little bit of a history with regard to the loan and its arrangements. I also found that some of the wording was a bit interesting, that in here, under 4.1, that it was to assist the refurbishment of the Theatre Royal, but no terms and conditions for the loan were discussed, which I thought was a little unusual, but that's apparently what happened. They said, there's the money and away you go. But what is disturbing is that there's been this huge cone of silence since the loan was granted. It's interest-free. I would have thought that the Theatre Royal would have made an effort to try and at least start paying something towards the loan itself. Now, I remember this issue came up when Mr. Thomas did his investigation, he did his study into Theatre Royal and came back and said they need some changes. It's too much of a community and it should be more professional and all sorts of bits to try and get them back on track. And I don't really know where that went to. But I don't think we can let this matter lie. You can't just do this sort of thing. We had a similar instance to another body in Nelson not very long ago who felt that they were going to take their time paying back the loan, and we remedied that, and they're now back on track. But in this particular case, nothing has happened. And I find it actually quite annoying, considering that the Theatre Royal has got a bit of a history to it. And I was around when it was fundraising and when it received a substantial loan from the government. And then suddenly they've got themselves at that particular time into some further strife, and so the Council of the Day on the 1st of October 2009 agreed to this loan arrangement. And I've been fortunate enough to have copies of the minutes of that meeting to, I suppose you could say, confirm what's being written here. My argument is, I hope, very clear. You get a loan from the council. No terms and conditions were discussed at that stage. You are required to pay back the ratepayers' money in some form, through an arrangement or otherwise. But to have absolutely nothing for these years, I find quite strange. Very strange.
Thank you, Councillor Matheson. Any other comment on this? Councillor Rainey?
I note under item 5 on page 60 of the agenda, 5.1, that the council proposed in its long-term plan 2012-22 to take over ownership of the Theatre Royal and to allow the entity to focus on operating the facility. I'm a little bemused as to the line of questioning coming from Councillor Matheson on this issue. The pathway for ownership of the theatre by the city has been cleared through the High Court. The trust, it is my understanding, the trust are sitting around waiting and are in a holding pattern, waiting for direction from council as to what has happened over this issue. It's quite clear that the asset is worth many times more than the outstanding loan or the loan from council. So I think the issue is more than just the loan. The issue is about the asset and the value of the facility to the community. So I think the question of the loan is part of the mix of the issues surrounding this theatre that need to come to full council for consideration.
Thank you, Councillor Rainey. It's Madam Mayor.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Look, I'm just in terms of the officers and what the information they're getting. I'm just having a look at this. What's in the report, and it talks about the fact that there were no terms. There were no terms and conditions for the loan were discussed at the meeting, but there were terms and conditions for the loan that were then, because we had, from memory, because there would have had to have been some numbers put in the long-term plan, and so there would have had to have been some, or there may not have been any discussed, which was a little bit of a problem or more than a little bit of a problem, because otherwise things should really have been treated as a grant from the start, which might be the issue that we're now grappling with now. But there must have been something, because otherwise what did the officers put in the financials that they then submitted to audit?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ms Harrison, did you?
Through the chair, I mean, what I was trying to highlight there was just the time frame, because it really was covered in 4.2 in terms of the repayments. I mean, I haven't looked specifically, but I would assume effectively it's just, you know, the plan was adopted and then they went and did the loan agreement afterwards, and that resolution was passed after the the community plan was adopted. I'm not quite sure what the assumption would have been in terms of loan repayments, but what the important part is the actual final loan agreements that are attached to this report were what was signed by the Theatre Royal.
Councillor Noonan?
Mr. Chair, look, I wasn't here when this whole thing started, so I'm coming at it from a different viewpoint. But when I'm looking at the paperwork and I see that there's several loan agreements, and then I see it looks like no payments, I can't work out why something didn't happen at that point. Why there wasn't a meeting, and why aren't you paying? And there's nothing. And if it was the intention that payments were to not carry on, then why wasn't there a change to the documentation? So if we look at the loans, there's nothing in there. There's no variation to the loan. There's nothing. So to me, it looks, unless there's something missing, I've still got 2 loan documents in front of me with payment schedules attached. Nothing's been paid. If in the paperwork it says if no payments are made, then the default interest rate applies, which is 12%, still nothing. So we've got all the way down here. So when we get to the report for February 2014, and I see in paragraph 3 that we're going to give, well, in paragraph 2 we're going to give them $100,000, and that some of that money was to be applied to the debt, and that we therefore expected them not to need an overdraft. So, and I haven't got anything here to say that the money that we gave them the debt was repaid and they're no longer operating an overdraft facility. So there's a little bit of some filling in to be confirmed that is no longer happening. So there's just a bit of a disconnect. And if it was the intention, there would have surely been a resolution of council that would then alter the loan agreements. And I can't see that. So there's a bit of documentation that's not here in front of me. There may be some somewhere, but I haven't got it. So there are just a few things that aren't connecting for me, but it does concern me that there's no payments being made, and it looks like never has been.
Thank you, Councillor Noonan. Did you want to comment on that, Ms Harrison, before I try and reach a conclusion?
I think, so in that previous report, when it was talking about clearing the bank's overdraft, it wasn't talking about repaying us, and I have been monitoring that they have not been operating with an overdraft. Obviously they need to operate an overdraft at particular times of the year, but effectively that the net debt to the bank is not increasing is the important thing. In terms of the repayments, council has been aware all the way along that these repayments haven't been made, but soon the final documentation for the 300k was paid off and the repayments were deferred until a later date, and then that was when we started entering into the long-term plan 2012 to 22, and effectively it's been in a holding pattern since.
So, take Councillor Murray, Councillor McGurk, Mr Murray, Councillor McGurk, and then
I'm just picking up what's been said before. I'm just wondering, what are the series of undertakings that have been given by council to the trust that has allowed this sort of situation to evolve? There's no documentation. There must be some kind of undertaking, some kind of communication given by council to the trust.
Through the chair, I'm unclear what that mean.
Well, the answer you gave up just a moment ago about council's done this and we're aware of that. I'm just wondering, what are those undertakings that the council have given? Or what are the undertakings that the trust has given to council that are not included in the documentation that we've got in front of us?
Through the chair, I haven't been party to those undertakings.
Mr Murray?
Thank you, Mr Peters. I suppose my conclusion reading the document on its face is that it's a bit of a mess, and I'm probably not so interested in what happened yesterday, but what's going to happen tomorrow. Because I think we can go round and round in circles all day talking about why wasn't it collected and where it is. But we've got a clear understanding that we have some sort of legal agreement with the Theatre Royal, and there's a loan agreement definitely. We may have agreed to buy it, but I'm not sure about that because the proposal in the long-term plan doesn't actually say we will. So look, I came to the conclusion that I think that it's fundamentally important that council, and I'm not sure who, but council needs to meet with the Theatre Royal Trust, and it needs to be clearly established what their financial sustainability is moving forward. And in the context of the financial sustainability of the trust and what the trustees of that trust say, we can then have a look at our loan that's currently sitting there and consider that as to whether it's part of their sustainability model or not. So I think it's about what happens tomorrow, and I think that there's enough in this for me to say it's very unclear here, it's very unclear there, that there needs to be clarity, and the only way that that'll happen is by the two parties meeting and by the trustees of that trust providing some indication to us as to what their sustainable position is moving forward or not, which then we can better make some decisions about how we respond.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. I was going to say something very similar, that I think we all agree that however we've got here, and for the various interruptions that happened in a planned process, we're here, and what we have is a situation that is not ideal for anybody, but a situation where the trust is exposing itself to a serious breach of its contract, and I'm sure they're not comfortable with that. We're in a situation of not having received expected funds, and there are clearly going to be some options in the way that might be dealt with, and I think we're not going to establish those options here. I think we need to call for the creation of those options and the submission of them through the necessary process to resolve this issue. Councillor, I think Madam Mayor was first, and then Councillor Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think it does help actually to go back to understand the background to this, so to understand where we are now and the options that are available to us. So unfortunately I have got documents, but they were in public excluded at the time that the loan was entered into, and there is information there that is relevant to this discussion. So I'm a little bit hamstrung as to what I can actually say. Certainly I could answer Councillor McGurk's question, but I'd have to refer to a public excluded document. The dilemma we have, though, is that clearly for council to have entered into a loan, so if I'm thinking for council to have entered into a loan, it would have had, if we were talking generally, some reason to think that the person that it was entering into a loan with had the ability to make repayments. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Otherwise, if council didn't think so, then council shouldn't have been entering into a loan. Now, what you then look at is then you look at the history of this and you see there are no loan repayments. So then you have to ask yourself, in my mind, a couple of questions. Did council have insufficient or unreliable information and entered into a loan regardless? Well, that's not a very, and that's possibly the case. Or was information provided to council that actually wasn't then able to be relied upon? Because no money has traversed. But essentially where I would say we're at, and this has been, and I think I have mentioned that it's the last meeting, that there has only been one time when I have abstained from voting at council, and it was on this matter. In fact, I think you'll find if you go back and look at various minutes that I left the room on these matters, because there were some concerns in my mind as to the capacity of this organisation to make any loan repayments. And in my mind, I have always seen this as a grant. But the consequences of a grant at that time would have been a fairly hefty whack on rates. They would have seen the rates for that year go move considerably. There was a grant already given, that would have been another grant, but ultimately we need to understand whether the Theatre Royal have any capacity to make loan repayments now. In my mind, I am, as I'm thinking forward, and as you know that I do, towards next annual plans and long-term plans, I am essentially making a provision in there for, and I'm going to say this quite openly in front of the auditor who's sitting in the public gallery, for the need to write off this loan. But the consequence of doing that without the transference of the asset, again, has a major impact on the rates increases for the population of Nelson. And so almost by default, we are going to have to look at the ownership of the asset and the loan hand in glove. There isn't going to be any way out of that unless the Theatre Royal has financial position, and they're doing very well, but unless it's made a remarkable there's been a remarkable change of circumstances that they haven't then advised our Chief Financial Officer about, I'm not expecting to start to see significant loan repayment from this entity. Now, I may be wrong about that, and that might be why I think it's important that we perhaps ask some further questions, as you've been suggesting, before we go any further with this, because I do feel like we're operating in a bit of a vacuum. But in my mind, I have to say, this has always been a grant. It wasn't recognised by council at the time it was entered into as a grant, and for that reason, I did all that I could at that stage, which is to vote with my feet.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councillor Barker and Councillor Rain.
Thank you. Well, I went a bit further. I actually voted, and I voted against, if you look at the records, and I think the public of Nelson, the ratepayers of Nelson, would be aghast if they thought that what they were told was going to be a loan to keep this place going and get it up and running is now going to be written off. I think the next steps that we looked at are appropriate, but I think we need to take into account in both of these loan documents, sections 6, 7 and 8, which detail what should happen when default occurs. And that's what we should be doing.
Thank you, Councillor Barker. Councillor Rain.
But there seems to be significant silence from staff on this issue, which I find a little bit disturbing. And to suggest, Mr. Chair, that the Theatre Royal Trust is in breach of their contract, I think is, and to say that publicly, is a serious accusation to make. So I'm concerned by the tenor of this conversation. I would like to draw everybody's attention to the fact that there is a report from 2014 attached to the back of this report, which clearly states on page 92, under 7.8, the Council holds security of the Theatre Royal for the loan of $1.5 million. In addition, Nelson Building Society provides second mortgage of $640. Council has received no interest or principal repayments. Interest payments are made on the MBS loan. The report suggests no change in the loan arrangements, whilst options for future ownership remain unclear. Now that is a two-way thing. The situation of sorting out the ownership of the Theatre Royal needs two parties to discuss that issue. And we are all very aware of the fact that the Theatre Royal Trust are absolutely happy to go into discussions with the council, and they're desperate to go into discussions with the council about ownership. It's just an issue that has been parked. Now, if you go subsequently to 9.4 on page 93, down the bottom of there, and under 9.4, in conclusion, funding for the 2014-15 year would need to be increased to $220,000 in order to meet the NHTT's operating expenses. This grant would not provide for any repayment of capital on the loans from council or NGOs. Now, as has happened, they have made some repayments. I'm under the impression, although at least they've been making interest repayments to NBS. Now, I think it's really important to realise that situation of a $220,000 operating grant to the Nelson Historic Theatre Trust is made in negotiation with staff, and staff are very aware of that situation. There are a set of community outcomes that are negotiated and that are clearly spelled out in an agreement between council and the Theatre Trust. So I just would like to point out that it's very easy to do a bit of a beat up in this scenario, but actually the goodwill is strong. They do want to sort this out, and I absolutely don't accept that they are actively or knowingly being in breach of their contract. They are operating under the scenario that has been clearly presented between council and that trust.
Thank you, Councillor Rainey. I personally don't interpret any of the comments that have been made here as in any way antagonistic or indicative of an unwillingness to engage by the Trust. On the contrary, I think I prefaced my comments of certainly intended to imply that it was in everybody's interest to get this matter resolved, and that on the basis of the documents that we've got here, there is a risk of exposure to something like a breach which nobody seeks or desires. But that, for me, implies the need not to leave things in the current state that they are, but to seek resolution, and I think that's how I finished off my comment. So I don't think we're in violent disagreement on any of those points. Mr. Murray.
I was just going to make a comment for the because the auditor is here, that while the loan is distressed, it's covered by the security. So, for the purposes of our reports, I'm sure we can hold it at value.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Councillor Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can just refer to the report, that previous report that was attached to the back of the agenda. It was written, if I right, in 2014. So up to that date, 7 years prior, when the Theatre Royal was granted the loan, is a period that is, I think, of some concern, and I think that's been highlighted by Her Worship. We're a little bit fortunate that there are 3 members of that council that day in this room. One wasn't in the room when it was being discussed, and that's been highlighted. But Councillor Rainey was, and Councillor Barker and Councillor Barker's made that clear. And I note also from the minutes that Councillor Rainey took no part in the discussion. But what does disturb me, and this is the point I'm trying to make, up until we decided to go into discussions on the future of the Theatre Royal, ownership or otherwise, nothing happened. And I don't think you can finger point staff, because at the end of the day, a council meeting is actually conducted by councillors. So that is concerning. So the halt came on when we started talking about whether we would or we wouldn't take a form of ownership. But I don't see that really as being an excuse. I think we should have still come to some arrangement, because we're just going backwards and no one was going forward. So I agree with Mr. Murray and others that we should sit down with the Theatre Royal and say, what arrangements can we make to at least make some inroads into this loan, while the issue of the future of the Theatre Royal is being discussed. And I think we should be mature in our outlook as we are, to try and do our very best for our ratepayers.
Thank you, Councillor Matheson.
Mr. Chair, I don't want to extend this too much longer, but I would note there was no submission from the Theatre Royal in the annual plan. So we've had no submission of desperation or anything else for transfer of assets. There's been nothing come through. I would normally expect to see that. I think there is, at the time the loan was entered into, the transfer of the assets was certainly not on the table. That was not a matter that was up for discussion at that point. That's come much later in the piece and went hand in glove with the School of Music. So there was some to create a joint governance structure, and that was, essentially where it came from, and the issue with the assets. But ultimately, we are going to have to decide whether we've got a loan or a grant. That's really where we've got to get to, and I think that it is worth having that discussion with the trustees. As I've said previously, I am really in a position where, once the loan was entered into, in what I consider to be a situation where I couldn't see any possibility of the loan being repaid. And in fact, the history would say that that was a reasonably fair assessment. And in fact, I was willingly granting and put a recommendation to council to double the operating grant to the Theatre Royal, because even at the level of operating grant that we had in the previous council, they were really struggling to operate. And I want those organisations to thrive. but we are going to have to address this. Now, this annual plan wasn't the time to do that, but I would have to say it's probably not too far away when we are going to have to work out what we're going to do here. Are we retaining a grant? Are we essentially providing a grant and dealing with the assets and how that works, or are we having a continuing a loan with some loan repayments? Because there is a point really where a suspensory loan, you know, how long is that appropriate? How long can you have a loan with no repayments?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Was there anything further on this? If not, have we agreed a point where we are requesting from staff a paper that points out the options and the consequences, potential impact of the options as they face us, so that council can take the appropriate action to regularise and formalise the position, whatever it may be. And I would seek support for asking staff to undertake that task.
Mr. Chair, could I suggest that would be a matter that would need to be addressed through an annual plan or potentially a long-term plan, in terms of we have to work within the constraints and the framework of our current long-term plan. I think preparing the information so that council can be informed about its choices moving forward is useful, but I wouldn't like to get to the point where I think there's many a conversation to be had and information to be gathered before we start to frame that up into a matter that would require consultation with our community. I think we've got to probably get there, but I wouldn't like to feel that the council were a situation was being created where this committee, and they may well wish to do that, essentially taking a directional role in relation to some of those choices for the community, because it still needs to be consulted on.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have to say, I think from my perspective there are several dimensions to this, and I agree that any subsequent actions that might talk about ownership changes and those, I think, is a matter for the annual plan. However, I think there may be options related to debt recovery or establishment and management of what is effectively a debtor, and I wonder whether we should have something coming to this committee. If one of the options is, as we're talking about, relating to the ownership, then I absolutely agree that cannot be dealt with here, that would need to be deferred. But there may in fact be other options that need to be considered by this group before that step is taken. Councillor Barker.
Yes, and I agree with you. I think those options need to come back to this committee, and I think for the other purpose being that will be the last meeting of this committee and this council, and it will leave a summary for the incoming council of where the position is.
I'm just advised by officers that the next meeting on the 4th of August is probably too early to achieve that.
The options?
The option paper? The options, that would be too... So it would have to be at a subsequent meeting. Councillor McGurk?
Well, before we profess the options, I think it would be useful just having a summary of a report summarising actions to date, what decisions have been taken, what undertakings have been given. At least we've got some.
I would find that useful as part of an options paper that will help us evaluate, will help the
that will be part
committee.
of, I suppose, the ongoing discussions you want to have with the trust at that point. I think which is critical, and then that can help sort of frame up some options which can come back at a later date. As the Mayor has said, it's probably something that can be talked about with the annual plan round.
I would expect that the formulation of options paper is likely to involve discussion. I would leave that to staff. Councillor Linden?
Mr. Chair, are we working towards some sort of formal either resolution or asking of a paper or something from this meeting?
I was seeking support to ask for a paper doing just that.
Excellent.
Do I have support for such a paper being requested to come to the first opportunity to do that, addressing the points that Councillor McGurk has raised, and putting those options to this committee in due course? I'm getting nods, so if we can ask for that report. Interesting, I didn't notice a resolution asking for this particular paper to come at the last meeting. It was just a request for a report.
It was just due to fantastic chairmanship.
Well, in that case, would somebody please formulate, if we need a resolution, would somebody please?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, for interrupting. I think a resolution would be the best because then it goes onto a status report and you don't lose it. Because we're pretty good at, we councillors are pretty good at losing things.
Well, I think it might be useful, particularly over a potential change in membership of this committee over the end of the triennium. So, is somebody prepared to put some?
And a summary report with options be asked for. Be sought for the next meeting of the committee.
A seconder for that?
A summary paper with options.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I cannot commit to a report for the next meeting of this committee. That would need
Councillor Barker?
And understand that and was seeking, if possible, to leave for the new incoming council a summary of where the situation is. But I guess if it takes longer than can be done in the next 5 weeks, it can be just as useful when it comes to the new council.
I've got stories.
We have one from the mayor.
Well, we'll see if this will work. That the committee is updated on options to address the outstanding Theatre Royal loan. Would that be sufficiently? And Councillor McGirt might have some better words. It was very quick.
The words that I have, that a report from officers summarising current loan arrangements and that officers continue discussions with the trust and then on a report presenting some options for the... That's what the mayor said. There was basically 3 parts.
Can we adjourn for a couple of minutes? We'll get a resolution in place. Okay, can we reconvene, please? We have a resolution drafted. So we've tried to keep it reasonably simple and recognise the timeframes, and that a report of available options in relation to the Theatre Royal loan is prepared for the Audit, Risk and Finance Subcommittee or its successor. Do I have a proposal for that?
I'll move it.
Thank you, Councillor McGurk. And a seconder. Mr. Murray over there next to the coffee machine. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Yeah. Sounds flash, the coffee machine. Okay, not water cylinder. Next item is with the committee's agreement. I'd like to bring item 12 forward to its original and rightful place, because we put it back, Bede, in the thought that you might be detained. You've outrun us, so welcome to the table, and could you take us through? You and Nikki take us through.
Welcome, Bede. Thank you. Through the chair, the interim audit for this year end was done in mid-April. There are a number of recommendations that audit have made in relation to contract management, project management, and there are a number of other issues raised in their letters. Happy to take any questions that you may have for either myself or Bede.
Perhaps before we do that, Bede, you would like to add to the letter and to the.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, well, look, I'd see the report as being a relatively positive findings. The areas that we've identified, that Nikki referred to, around contract management and project management. What we're talking about there is sort of movement towards having a consistent approach across the organisation, and I think that fits in with what's happening in the risk management space. So you're already taking initiatives there. So we see that all as positive. These things take time, and so I don't have any concerns that I want to raise in those areas. Just acknowledging progress. The more traditional part of our audit, looking at the financial and non-financial systems. Overall, we felt systems are designed appropriately and generally operating well. There are a couple of recommendations and findings that we've put in a separate report to management, but not matters of particular concern that I felt I needed to raise directly with this committee. And so, all in all, interim audit went well, and we're now sort of gearing ourselves. We'll be having internally another planning meeting just to make sure that we're sharply focused for the final audit when that starts. We'll be having other conversations with management. We've got agreed timeframes just to make sure that both parties are primed and ready to go on the time, because little flexibility this year, particularly around election cycles, but also we've got some internal tightness this year in terms of our resourcing. So if things don't go well, it'll be very difficult to recover any lost time. So we just want to make sure that we're ready and that information flows as smoothly as it can.
I'll open up for any questions of either Ms. Harrison or Mr. Kenny. While that's happening, I can just comment that in relation to the management letter, I met with Ms. Harrison and the Chief Executive, and I concur with Mr. Kenny's comments of nothing of significance to come to this committee. Councillor Barker, I think you had your hand.
Thank you. Bearing in mind the discussions we had earlier on the procurement policy and other policies that were there in front of us today, and taking into consideration 4.5, Nikki, can I ask you, on page 101, the audit letter says it's good practice for a single organisation-wide contract register which allows the trade and expenditure against contracts and separate management for variations. Do we actually have that single register, organisation-wide?
excuse me, through the chair, in 4.4, we do agree that we should develop a centralised system, and that's certainly something that we're investigating at the moment. And at the moment they're recorded on numerous spreadsheets within each department, and the problem that you have with that is the ability for someone to monitor and audit those contract rollovers are actually occurring in a timely manner. So we're investigating putting in place a system, and I've just seen that Marlborough have just purchased quite a good one. So speaking of shared services, we're looking to tap into potentially using a similar one to them.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? If there's no other questions or comments to be made, do I have a mover that the recommendation that the interim audit letter for the year ended June 30th, 2016 and its attachment be received, and its suggested responses to the recommendations are noted. Mr. Murray, Councillor Barkhoff is next. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. King. Okay, we move to item 13, capital projects carry forwards, and I think this is Ms. Hughes back to the table.
Through the chair, I will just do a very brief quick introduction to this report. Both this report and the next report are really at this point in time procedural to allow us to continue to work on the projects that should have occurred and been completed this year but have rolled into the next financial year. So procedurally, we in the last few years have been putting up a recommendation that allows us to continue to do the work on those projects, and obviously to substantiate the report, there's a reasonable level of detail as to what these projects are, and I'll hand it across to Tracy and Shane to speak to it.
Through the chair, I'm not sure I have an awful lot to add, except that I hope you'll have read these two reports in conjunction with the corporate report, because they do fit together like a little bit of a jigsaw, particularly the report coming on operating expenditure. So those big gaps that we've got in capital expenditure and also in operating surplus against budget, those big gaps are very largely explained by these two reports.
Thank you. Ms. Hughes, any questions on capital projects carry forward report? Mr. Murray.
Thank you. Yeah, through the chair. Thanks for the report. It may be a question you can't answer at this point because you made it pretty clear that the report is coming later on. But do you have a ballpark figure of what the operational budget carried forward might be? The capital seems to be reasonably well defined, but the operating stuff is what in the ballpark of. And I suppose the context of my question is I'm sort of thinking if we. And I understand the concept of why we're doing it, but when we get into next year and then we start, I suppose, incurring expenses for which there's no revenue for because we're not collecting it in rates or anywhere else, that'll have an impact on our surplus and our bottom line in the following year. I was trying to get a bit of a bead on where it might look. And I appreciate it's a difficult one, you may say to me, and quite rightly so, come back and wait for the report. That's okay. But if you've got a ballpark figure, I appreciate it.
No pressure.
Through the chair, thank you for that out. It would be very difficult for me to put a ballpark figure on it. I'm afraid that the last month of the financial year, things basically come to a head, and that's really all I can say. It would be crystal ball gazing.
Oh, that's okay. No, I appreciate it, and that's fine. I was just looking for an idea.
Any other questions? Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just looking through the, I mean, there's an awful lot of projects in here. So there's lots, and some of them, the history of them I'm well aware of. They've been reported through our traffic light process, so we know they're all coming, and the reasons why, and some of them add, as you've said, $7.5 million on that first page, which all of those will be matters that we're reasonably familiar with, except for some of the very small items at the bottom. Then I come across and I see projects underway on page 109, and I would look at the third column from the top, which is sealed road resurfacing, where I'm looking at a carry forward of $359,000. Well, that's a reasonable proportion, third of the budget. What's causing that? And my apologies, you may spell out the detail later in the report, so if it's there, then I can hold the question. But I'm just wondering why we're looking at that degree of projects underway but carrying forward, because that won't be one road. I take it that'll be a series of projects. May not be though.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll try and answer that question. It doesn't fall within the Capital Projects business unit, but I have experience in managing that business unit in the past. So generally, what happens is the program for sealing roads is developed over 3 years, and I expect that what it is, it's moving money to fit the effort of large sites. So you might have one very large road that takes up all the revenues budget, so the money is shifted. But generally, it is a budget that is never underspent. It's one that's accurately forecast and spent over the 3 years.
Right, so we'd be better to look at this one rather than on an annual basis. We'd be better to watch it over 3 years and see that it's tracking through. So, right, that's helpful. Then, if Mr. Chair, I just asked just another question. I lost my page on this one. Yes, that is in relation to a matter that has concerned me for a while, which is on the page 110. And I see in the middle of that somewhere the global consent for gravel extraction and minor streams, and I'm seeing that not yet underway and carried forward to the next financial year. And I'm just wondering if we've got some timing on that, because we've been waiting a very long time for that to progress.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is another project that falls within the operations business unit, so I can find out the information and report back too.
Perhaps Mr. Levertis can give us a quick update as he's in the room.
So through the chair, yes, that has been delayed, but it's all linked into the code of help me out, Jane. Code of practice for working in the streams, which we're busy working through. That is in itself linked to liaising with iwi and the cultural impact assessment. So they're all linked. They're all linked as one item, and we're trying to get the practice code sorted out. Liaising with iwi, along with that is a cultural impact assessment, which goes with all of those, and then that'll lead into how we deal with the gravel. So this has taken us a little bit longer than we would have liked, to be fair, but it is a process that we are working through, and we're trying to bring all parties along with us at the same time.
So follow-up question, Mr. Chair. No, Susie, is this one showing on our traffic lights? So we see this one. Sorry, next what I call the traffic lights, these ones. Will we see that there?
So through the chair, the traffic lights refer to in the main capital projects, whereas this is related to an operations. It's clearing of gravel under the operations budget, not the capital budget, which is what Shane's traffic light report does.
All right. So can I just check, because this one has really concerned me, and I've raised this several times about risk. So I understand that you need to go through a consent process. I understand all of that, but I also understand that if we have build-up of gravel in our streams, in our rivers, and the heavens are opening, we have some problems. So I just need to get a sense of, and we've seen this reported where we've been waiting for capital projects. We've had capital project delays because we've been waiting for the resource consenting process to go through. Are these related or unrelated? So this, I understand, is just removal of gravel, but then we've had other ones where we're looking at the consents required around the capital projects. Are they interrelated in any way?
So through the chair, yes, they are interrelated. So there are a number of projects that Shane has within his capital works program that require resource consents that will require the code of how we work in streams as well as cultural impact assessments. And then there is work that we undertake in the operational field that are also linked to that code and also linked to the CIA process. So they're separate, but they're the same.
All right then, Mr. Chair, what I'm going to ask is that could we keep this as a, somehow, I don't know whether we may have to, I don't want to have to resolve something to get it on a status report, but I think I've had this conversation and waited for, it could be over a year now, I think it's well over a year, and it sits within our risk profile. And I understand the complexity, I absolutely do, but there is a point where we're either going to get the consent or we're not going to get the consent. Because if we're not going to get the consent, without the consent, we're sitting there with the risk, and we've got to get this addressed. Sorry, it's, you know, having met with somebody yesterday whose business was flooded in our 2013 floods, they believe me, the heavens start again, and they start talking to me about why is this work not progressed that we've been waiting on.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. As you know, I've shared your concerns about that particular street clearance, and I think one of the things that concerns me is that if it doesn't appear here, for the reasons that Mr. Levertis has said, it's an operational issue rather than a capital issue, so it doesn't appear on this traffic light. It does appear in the risk report, but we only see that every 3 months. And I think this is probably reaching a stage where it's of a priority and a risk level going into another very wet season, that the profile does need to be raised, and whether we have that on a status report or in some way, I would like to see it, a regular report received on the progress on this, and I'll look for guidance as to what's the best way of achieving that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I can liaise with the operations team and have it added to our traffic light report.
That would be useful, thank you. Councillor Noonan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I'm just picking up on an item in the social, because that's sort of where I work. There's 170,000 on artworks, but no commentary. Third from the bottom on 109.
Is anybody able to respond to that, or can we get a reply coming into your course?
Yeah, that's what I put it up.
Through you, Mr. Chair. The Artworks program is a program of artworks that comes out over a number of years. So we have a couple of projects, one that we're aiming to implement in July, and then another one that comes out later in the calendar year. So the carryover of that money will be to meet the program for artworks as they come out.
So, Mr. Chair, can we just have a bit of commentary added to that, because it's blank at the moment, so it'd be nice to have just what it is. That'd be great.
No problem.
This next report on operating expenditure carry forwards is a new report and a new process. There was a suggestion that it could be incorporated with the previous report, but because it is new, I thought it beneficial to separate it. It does come from the same place in that we are looking for approval to continue projects that are in the current year work plan. But we haven't had to go through this process previously because we used to do an exercise and it would all be built into the annual plan process. Doing it this way does give you an extra report to look at, but I think it's actually more accurate because it is later in the financial year. That, I think, is all I have to say, and I'm happy to take any further questions or any questions.
Mr. Murray.
Thank you for the report. My question related to that item in the previous item about the impact on the surplus and what you thought. So no wonder you look confused. So I just wanted to point it out. I jumped an item. My apologies.
Any other questions? Are we comfortable with this being a new report and approaching this in this way? Is this going to be the way that you anticipate this matter being dealt with in future years as well?
Through the Chair, yes, at this stage I would anticipate that being the case. The projections exercise was fairly resource intensive along with the annual plan work. It's just occurred to me as well to point out that these projects are what we call programmed expenditure. So we're not looking to carry forward any day-to-day maintenance or unprogrammed provision kind of expenditure. So this is stuff that we had identified that we wanted to do this year, and for various reasons it hasn't been completed.
Thank you. If there's no further questions, I have a mover and a seconder that the report be received and that it go to governance, recommended to Governance Committee and Council, noting the final report will come to the Governance Committee meeting on 25th of August 2016. Mr Murray, thank you. Councillor Gert, thank you. All those in favour, please say aye. Against?
Thank you, Mr Chair. So, for the purposes of the corporate report, and as I said, it's beneficial to discuss this, I suppose, in conjunction with previous two reports. As at the end of April, the activity surplus is 4.1 million favourable to budget, and from the previous report we've identified 3 million of expenditure that we wish to carry forward. Capital, likewise, is currently 14.4 million under budget, and we're looking to carry forward 14.3. Other things to note is the transfers of delegation, particularly in respect of the draft annual report and the final carry forwards report. Unfortunately, the timing is such that it will not be able to come to this committee for its final meeting, and we'd like to refer that delegation to the final meeting of the Governance Committee. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Just make the comment that I found the addition of the arrows useful in light of the sometimes confusing dot coloration. So that's been useful. Councillor Matheson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Can I go to point 7 regarding the shade sale? I thought originally, and you please correct me, that it was going to be a permanent fixture?
Through you, Mr Chair, I don't know the answer to that question, but we can find out.
Yeah, the reason through you, Mr Chair, the reason I ask you that is because if we're going to leave it to the events and organisers, I could see some problems by putting it up and taking it down. The second part is, will it be ready for this Christmas festive season in sunshine?
Again, I'm not sure of the answer of that, but I can report back on that one.
Mr Murray.
Yes, on page 122, under other operating revenue, this sort of jumped out at me a little bit in that it said that we've got a timing difference of 104,000 for book fair proceeds due in June. And that raised two questions for me. One, I suppose it was about understanding why are we getting $104,000 from the sale of books. I don't understand that. Is that do we run the book fair, the Nelson City Council? That's the first thing. And the second thing is what sort of controls have we got around that if that's actually owing to us, that we actually do get it?
Chair, Founders runs the book fair, which happens in June. That's not owing to us, that's a budgetary problem, as I mentioned, I think a couple of reports ago, that we are looking at this year, actually aligning the budgets to where we think the expenditure will fall, rather than just dividing by 12 and putting a 12th into each month. So the money's not actually owing to us, it's just the 10/12ths of budget.
So in cash terms, we're not expecting any money from the book fair.
Through the Chair, the book fair is 100% cash, and that would all come in June. To Founders, which is an activity of council.
Thank you. Other questions on the corporate report? Madam Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The KPI on capital expenditure. How are we doing? Are we going to hit it? Are we going to meet it? I'm just asked this question every time, and I'm looking at these graphs and I'm getting a bit nervous.
Through you, Mr. Chair, taking into consideration the big items like the Trafalgar Centre, Rutherford Park and Hamden Little, I would put that in that category too, as being decisions of council that has led to carry over, then I think we'll be fine.
Thank you, Shane. I'm very pleased to hear that answer.
Any further questions? Question from me is, have we had any, done any work, had any indication of any exposure on the leave pay epidemic that seems to be sweeping the country?
Through the Chair, we are still investigating that further.
Thank you. Any further questions? If there are none, could I have a recommendation that the report and its attachments be received, and that the subcommittee refer to the governance committee its delegation for the review of the draft annual report and the 2015-16 carry forwards report? Do I have a mover for that? Councillor McGurk, thank you. Seconded by Councillor Barker. All those in favour, please say aye. Against carried. We have no public excluded item of the agenda, so I think I am able to declare the meeting closed. Thank you to the staff. Thank you to all. And over to Mr. Murray.